Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to take a look at additive rhythms, and it's all going to be in the context of Cubase. We're going to use some Cubase specific features to discuss this today. First things first, if you've not come across the concept of additive rhythms before, this is where you have a time signature that's comprised of smaller sub-component time signatures of unequal length. So if you find yourself counting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, your time signature is 5/4, but the additive rhythm is 3/4 plus 2/4. You literally add the fractions together to derive that single time signature final output value. Now, the reason this is important and why we're talking about it today is that time signatures have a very practical role to play in our songwriting, and I'm going to use the piece of music that I'm writing at the moment to demonstrate exactly this concept. So anyway, without further ado, let's just get underway. This is where we started with this piece of music. I started with the rhythm and I randomly chose 5/4. Quite clearly tell it's a 5/4 rhythm. Here's the fill. Everything's nice and easy so far. Where we get ourselves into trouble, however, is when we introduce the first musical element. Here's the bass line. We're still in 5/4, we've still got exactly the same rhythm, but that bass line no longer really fits very comfortably inside a 5/4 pattern. To my ears, it's doing something very much other than 5/4. The real smoking gun is this second low A, because it's happening on the 5th beat of the bar. It's not happening at the beginning of the bar on beat number 1, it's happening on the last beat of the 5/4 count. And it's such a strong accented note, that's really what's kind of encouraging you to think outside of the 5/4 box. So what I want to do is effect a solution that's going to allow me to play musically over the top of this thing. If I stick in 5/4, I'm not really hearing that bass line in the context of 5/4, so it's going to be very difficult to play music over the top of it. So let's have a look at some alternatives. Well, the first alternative is to stretch the time signature so it's covering twice the distance. An easy way to do that with time signature is to have your denominator count in half notes rather than quarter notes. And the way that we do that is that we make the signature 5/2 instead. Now that inconvenient straggling note is actually directly on a beat. So we've solved kind of, if you want to call that the main problem, the fact that this note was overhanging, it no longer is. The problem with this approach is that I don't want to halve the tempo. I've effectively halved the number of metronome clicks I'm going to get when I play this piece back. It kind of fits better, but it only fits better because we're having half the number of clicks. So yes, technically it's doing the job, but it's not helping me musically. That's really not giving me any more guidance. So that is not an appropriate solution. Back to 5/4 we go. Let's think about it from another perspective. The highlighted notes here covering 2 bars are 1 phrase. Let's view it from that perspective. So now instead of having 5 beats over 2 bars, let's have 10 beats over 1 bar. Now 10/4 isn't a time signature you're going to see very often. In fact, from a classical perspective, this isn't how you would notate music. And this is one of my issues with the whole concept of time signatures generally. They're very score oriented. A large part of why time signatures exist and why we have this standardized protocol for them is because classical musicians in a large orchestra all need to be able to speak a common language. It's a generic standard that doesn't fit every circumstance, and sometimes, in this case here, it falls apart, it doesn't work properly. Fortunately, we're not actually constrained by any technical definitions here. I'm a solo musician writing music for myself, so it's perfectly okay for me to use 10/4. Don't let anybody tell you that it isn't. The problem is it's not very useful, because after you've counted that main beat on 1, you've now got 9 peer beats that are just kind of doing the same job. So we're going to need to do a little bit more work to make this thing useful for us. Don't forget, it's all about being practically useful. I want this metronome to help me get into the groove of the piece of music so I can write some stuff over the top of it. So what's really happening in this rhythm? Well, to my ears, and those are the only ears that matter because I'm writing this thing, I'm hearing 4 beats, followed by 3 beats, followed by 3 beats, repeated ad nauseum. So I need to teach Cubase to give me that metronome pattern. That's very easy to do by defining our own bespoke click pattern. Now you might not be able to see this little strip. It depends whether or not you've got the time signature editor fully open, and if you do, you're going to get access to this click pattern and an open metronome setup button. Let's click that, and then we go into click patterns. If we scroll down, you'll see 10/4 isn't a default time signature. That's no problem at all. We can create one. I'm going to double click this add new time signature button, and I'm going to say 10/4, hit enter. I'm going to define myself a default pattern. And this little asterisk denotes what your default pattern is. You see, you can change the asterisk by clicking in this little box. But I don't want to use the default pattern. I want to use a bespoke pattern that contains 3 subcomponents: a 4 and a 3 and another 3. What we do then is click in the pattern itself. We get a little editor that pops up, and I select the main beats that I want to hear. Having defined my click pattern, I can now come out of metronome setup. That hasn't yet activated that new pattern that I've created. Can you see that we're still on the generic default pattern? You need to click in the pattern editor itself and then drop this little drop down box down. Here's my 4+3+3. And now that we've selected that, let's listen to this bass line in that context. That's what I'm hearing in my head. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. The more you read about time signatures, the more you come to realise that they're an entirely Western construct. There are entire nations, in fact continents around the world, that really don't subscribe to the time signature concept at all because they simply don't work. Many cultures use additive rhythms completely by default, and this is their standard method of operation. 4/3/3 is a very common subdivision of what we would call the 5/4 time signature. And as it happens, that's what I inadvertently did when I wrote this bass line. I had no idea, it just kind of came from that odd place that music comes from. But once I'd done it, it created a huge problem for me writing any other music because I just couldn't get into the groove until I plugged in this additive pattern, and then the rest of it fell in line very easily. So as far as the piece of music that was cycling around here, this is the Rhodes piano and guitar line that sprang out of this rhythm. You can hopefully really hear me leaning musically into that additive rhythm. And while I had the standard 5/4 rhythm going, I just couldn't get into the groove. I couldn't lock into that bass line, and everything felt really clunky. And now here's an example of a different part of the song where I'm extending that concept into a melody. Take the click away. Playing this melody, I mean, eventually you stop counting the numbers, but while I'm coming up with these melodic ideas, that's very much in my head. And it ends up being a really melodic piece. I'm quite pleased with this thing as it's developing. It's starting to show promise of being something that I'm really quite into. That would have been much more difficult to do over the simple 5/4 rhythm, Just before we call it a day today, I'll mention one quick thing as far as the features in Cubase are concerned that would be a possibility in a piece of music like this, and that's to use a dynamic time signature. I've created myself a time signature track here. One possible approach for me would have been to have defined time signatures that varied every 2 bars, and that kind of structure would also work, but of course it's hugely clunky because you're having to manually type in a time signature every bar, but this will work. I don't get that second stress beat off the 6/4, and I really don't want the faff of having to create 2 separate 3/4s, which you could do. I mean, everything is possible. But eventually it becomes pretty absurd, and you start asking yourself, why on earth are you going to all of this trouble when you can define one global time signature with internal beat structures inside it that completely does the job? It's going to be a much more elegant solution and avoids the need for all of this nonsense. That'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content like this. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.